everyone, so this is my first video I'm making of my Sunday spooky stories. I usually post them in a story format, but a lot of people have been asking for them in a video format as well. I decided to make a video on this week's topic. I'm also gonna keep posting the stories onto my Instagram stories because I really like that format. Today's story is going to take us to 19th century Edinburgh. In the 19th century, Edinburgh was the leading European center for anatomical study, but since they were doing so well with their studies and their science, there was actually a shortage for cadavers for medical students to be learning and working with. Part of this was because Scottish law only allowed bodies to be donated for medical purposes if someone died by suicide, if they died in prison, or if they were orphans that passed away. So just to go back to the topic of the shortage, this actually led to body snatching, basically grave robbers. It became so bad that families actually watched their loved ones that passed away. They used to watch their graves and they built watchtowers so families could do this. Grave robbers were also referred to as resurrection men. Another thing that they did in this time was they built mort safes, which essentially it looks like kind of like a prison cell or like a safe around the actual grave so that the grave robbers could not get inside and steal the body. But even though that was a really good idea and it was done to help protect people's loved ones that died, it also, in a way, contributed to the shortage that was going on. There's two people I'm going to talk about today in my little video. That would be William Burke and William Hare. William Burke was born in 1792 in Ireland. He had a pretty comfortable upbringing with his family and he joined the British Army as a teenager. During his service in the army, he met a woman and they became married, but he ended up deserting her and he went to Scotland. When he moved to Scotland, he began to work on the Union Canal and eventually he met a woman there named Helen MacDougall, and that is who he married in Scotland. In Scotland, Burke worked as a cobbler and he was really well known among his community and he was really well liked by them also. The next person is William Hare. The exact date of his birth is not known, but like William Burke, he was also born in Ireland. Like Burke also, Hare worked on the Union Canal for quite a few years. He eventually moved to Edinburgh as well, and there he worked as a coalman's assistant. He also lodged at a lodge that was called Tanner's Close, which was owned by a man named, I don't know if I pronounce it right, Logue, and his wife Margaret. So Logue ended up dying and then Hare married Margaret, who was previously married to Logue, and he took over the lodge. Hare was known by many to be quarrelsome, violent, and immoral. Burke and Hare would end up meeting in Midlothian. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right either, but they both went there to work on the harvest. Burke and Hare became friends and then they both traveled back to Edinburgh, and then Burke and his wife Helen actually ended up moving in with Hare and his wife Margaret into the lodge. While in the lodge, the couples super quickly became friends and they were really known for their heavy drinking and for just being super rowdy and boisterous. On November 29th, 1827, a man by the name of Donald, who was a lodger in Hare's lodge, passed away. Donald owed rent to Hare, and since he died, they had no way of getting it. Burke and Hare came up with the idea to sell his body to make some money. Their idea was to sell his body to a local anatomy school. A carpenter came to prepare the coffin for Donald, so the coffin was built and Donald's body was placed into the coffin. Before they could come and take Donald's body away for burial, Burke and Hare actually opened the coffin and they filled it with wood and bark, and then they resealed the coffin. So then they waited for the coffin to be buried, and then once that was all gone, they actually took Donald's body to be sold. They originally wanted to sell it to a man by the name of Professor Monroe, but they ended up selling it to a man named Dr. Knox instead. Dr. Knox's office was in Surgeon Square and they received £7 and 10 shillings for the body of Donald. And it's said that when Burke and Hare left, Dr. Knox's assistant actually said, "I would be glad to see them again if they had another body to dispose of." Obviously, at this point, Burke and Hare are kind of seeing how lucrative this is to sell bodies. They're getting lots of money. Back then, also, 7 pounds is worth about 744 pounds now. And just like I said, how they could see how this could be so lucrative, of course, it would take a dark turn somewhere, and the first murder happened in 1828. Hare had a tenant by the name of Joseph, and he was an older man, and he became ill. To speed the process up, Burke and Hare decided to give him lots of whiskey. He was drunk. You know, it makes people pass out. They're not as coherent. And then they suffocated him. So they used a pillow to smother him, and then they put their hand over his mouth and nose so that he couldn't breathe at all. Their idea behind doing this was that it left the body like unmarked and undamaged, which was really important for what they were doing because they wanted to sell it to schools for anatomy usage. And if they're doing work and dissections on bodies, they really wanted them in like pristine, perfect condition for the students to learn and work with. Their way of killing actually became known as burking. Hare would suffocate the victim and Burke would lay on top of their torso. And back then, that method was practically undetectable because modern forensics were not around. So what they were doing, I guess essentially they kind of knew what they were doing and they were killing people without leaving a trace. Another early victim that they had was Abigail Simpson, and she was a salt seller. On February 12, 1828, she was invited to Hare's Lodge and she went. So of course, just like their previous victim, Abigail was given lots of whiskey as well. After they gave her a bunch of whiskey and she became very drunk, since they gave her so much whiskey, they were then able to suffocate and murder her as well. They put her in a tea chest and that's how they brought her to Dr. Knox. For Abigail, Burke and Hare received 10 pounds each because Dr. Knox said he liked how fresh the body was. Also, another victim, the month is unknown. It was either in February or March 1828. Margaret, who was Hare's wife, invited an older woman into the house. And then, of course, once again, this woman was given lots of whiskey and she was suffocated and murdered in the same way that the previous victims were. Dr. Knox also gave 10 pounds for the old woman. Another victim includes Mary Patterson, who ended up at their lodge with her friend Janet Brown. Luckily, Janet was not murdered, but unfortunately, Mary was. Burke met Mary and Janet while he was out at a tavern. He bought them drinks and then he invited them back to Hare's Lodge. Mary actually fell asleep at the lodge, and what happened is Janet and Burke were talking. Helen, who is Burke's wife, walked in on Janet and Burke and she thought that they were having an affair and she was very angry, and it ended up that her and Burke got into a fight. He threw a glass at her, it hit her above her eye, and her eye, it was cut. Because of the fight, Janet ended up leaving. So after Janet Brown left because of the fight that happened between Burke and his wife Helen, Mary, asleep in her room in the lodge, was actually murdered by Burke and Hare. Janet would return the next morning to ask if they had seen her friend or if Mary was still at the lodge, but they just told her that she had left with a traveling salesman and they had no other information. Once again, Burke and Hare brought her body to Dr. Knox. This time they were given 8 pounds, told Dr. Knox that they found a young drunk girl who happened to drink herself to death. In early or mid 1828, there was also another victim, Mrs. Halden. She was an older woman, and again, she was given lots of whiskey and then she was murdered and suffocated as well. Mrs. Halden's daughter Peggy actually came looking for her mother at the lodge because she had heard that's where she was or that she had been seen there. Once she got in there, Burke invited her inside, they had some drinks, and then he killed her, suffocated, murdered her, and he actually murdered her alone at this time. And again, her body was also sold to Dr. Knox too. At this point, it seemed not really anyone was safe from Burke and Hare. They also murdered a grandmother and her grandson. In Burke's confession later on, he said that the young child that he murdered haunted him the most, and he frequently had like visions and dreams about the child's face when they murdered him. Family members were not spared by this either. Helen McDougal had a family member named Anne McDougal come visit them and stay at the lodge as well, and they even murdered her. So as you can see, this is just some of the murders that happened. There's more than this. These are just some that I chose to speak about and highlight, but the tipping point started to come when they murdered James Wilson. James Wilson was an 18-year-old man, and he was known as Daft Jamie. It's said that he was a savant, and he also had an injured foot that they said was deformed. He was really well known in the town, and he was frequently a children's entertainer, so he was really well liked among the town. He was actually lured to the lodge also by Burke and Hare, and he was given whiskey, but he was not as drunk as the other victims, so when they tried to kill him and suffocate him, he definitely fought back, but in the end they ended up murdering him as well. James' body was sold to Dr. Knox as well, but some of the students recognized his face, and they recognized him by his foot, and they started to question things a little bit. So Dr. Knox pretty much assured his students that there's no way that the body could be anyone that they could possibly know. As word started getting out about this a bit more and students started talking about it a little bit more, Dr. Knox actually amputated the foot that James had, and he actually chopped the head off also. Their final victim, which really led them to the tipping point, was Marjorie Docherty. They murdered her on October 31st, 1828. She was an Irish woman as well, so Burke lured her to the lodge by claiming his mother had the name Docherty as well, and that she was from the same part of Ireland. Once she got to the lodge, she was hanging out with Burke and Hare, and they began to give her whiskey too. At this point, Hare had some other lodgers that were staying. Burke and Hare actually paid the lodgers that were staying in Hare's lodge to go somewhere else for the night. They just pretty much used the excuse that Marjorie was family from out of town, and they just really wanted to catch up with her because they haven't seen her. The family that Burke and Hare had asked to leave were the Greys, and the Greys actually returned the next day. When the Greys came back, they did ask where Marjorie Docherty was. Burke and Hare just basically said that they had her leave because they had been drinking and she had too much to drink, and she became very flirtatious. They wanted to go back into the room because they had some belongings that they wanted to get, but Burke would not let them into the room. He was being a bit suspicious. When the Greys were alone later in the day, they actually went into the room. Once they were in the room, they found Marjorie Docherty's body in a pile of straw at the end of the bed. This led to them going to the cops. On their way to the police, the Greys ran into Helen, who was Burke's wife. They told her what they saw, what was going on, and that they were going straight to the police. Helen tried to bribe them. She offered them 10 pounds a week if they did not say anything, but the Greys were like, no, we are going to the police to tell about this. Helen goes back to the lodge and she tells Burke and Hare what's going on. Since the Greys are at the police and now they kind of have a heads up on what's going on, they get rid of the body. So they go straight to Dr. Knox with the body. From the information that the Greys got, the police ended up going to the lodge. The police searched the lodge and they actually found Marjorie's bloody clothes stuffed under a bed. This led to Burke and Helen being questioned, and they both were pretty unclear and not consistent about Marjorie or when she left, so obviously this made the police very suspicious, and they were both arrested. From the research that the police were doing and the information that they were gathering, the search then led them to Dr. Knox. Once they got to Dr. Knox's office, they went to his dissecting room. This is where James Gray identified the body of Marjorie Docherty on the dissecting table. Knox was questioned as well by the police, of course, but he just told them that Burke and Hare were watching lodges around town, and whenever they noticed that someone died, they would purchase the body before it could be claimed, and then they would go and sell it to him so he would rebuy the body from them. Knox told them that he believed that he did nothing wrong at this point. Clothes from Mary Patterson were also found as well by Janet because she saw in the paper that they had written about this, and she went to the police and told them that she had actually been at the lodge with her friend and that her friend had disappeared. Also believed that Burke's nephew was spotted wearing James Wilson's trousers. This led to further investigation. Even though this led to more investigation, all of this information was, it was not actually enough to prove that murders had taken place and that it was done by Burke and Hare. With everything that was going on, though, it was enough at that time for the police to also arrest Hare and his wife Margaret. Like I said, the police were pretty certain that a murder had occurred, but they just weren't sure how they could prove it with the lack of evidence that they had going on. To get more information from the case and to be able to figure out what happened and to actually be able to charge someone, they offered Hare immunity, or king's evidence. This was on December 1st, 1828. So Hare being offered immunity, obviously he confessed up really quickly to Doherty and all the other murders that had happened. But Hare did say that he could not possibly testify against his wife, so Margaret was actually let go and the police decided that they could not prosecute her. Pretty crazy and interesting, because obviously she definitely was in on the murders with them, and she even lured women to the lodge as well. After Hare gave all his information for immunity, on December 4th, 1828, Burke and Helen were charged with murder. Knox had nothing filed against him as well, but a lot of people thought that Knox should be charged in this because they saw him as very influential over Burke and Hare, and they kind of saw him as a ringmaster. The trial took place. Burke and McDougal took the stand and they both pleaded not guilty, but Hare was also called to the stand. Hare gave all his evidence there. Some of the doctors on trial, they actually said that they suspected foul play. On December 5th, 1828, Burke was found guilty and he was sentenced to be hanged. His wife Helen, on the other hand, was found not proven, so she was just let go. On January 3rd, Burke actually gave a confession. In his confession, he placed most of the blame on Hare, and he said that Dr. Knox was pretty much innocent and he had nothing to do with it. On January 28th, 1829, Burke was hanged in a crowd of what's believed to be around 25,000 people. Which is crazy, just that in a span of 10 months, Burke and Hare had murdered over 16 people. And it's just crazy that only one of them was punished for the crime. Burke was. Hare got to go, Hare's wife Margaret got to go, and Burke's wife Helen got to go. On February 1st, 1828, Burke's body was actually displayed in an anatomy theater. So in this anatomy theater, Burke's body was actually publicly dissected by Professor Monroe. What's really interesting about him being publicly dissected by Professor Monroe is obviously the reason that his body is there is because he was arrested for murdering people for students to dissect. And also, Professor Monroe is who Burke and Hare originally had wanted to sell their bodies to. During the dissection, Professor Monroe actually dipped his quill into Burke's blood. He actually wrote a note in Burke's blood. It says, "This is written with the blood of W.M. Burke, who was hanged at Edinburgh. This blood was taken from his head." Burke's skeleton is actually still on display today, and you can go visit it at Edinburgh Medical Museum. This is the Medical School Anatomy Museum. His death mask is also there, and so is a book that is actually bound in the tan skin of Burke. It's kind of pretty gruesome, but I guess you could say it's kind of well-deserved for what he did to all those people. So Hare was released from prison on February 5th, 1829, and he was actually kept in jail for so long for his own safety. So Hare left by train, but he was recognized at a stop, and the police actually had to get involved, and they had to get a decoy so that they could get Hare to safety. To bring Hare to safety, they brought him to a prison, and they brought him there overnight, and then in the morning, they brought him out, and they pretty much were like, okay, you're on your own, you gotta go now, and they suggested that he goes to England. After that, no one really knows whatever happened to Hare. He pretty much was never seen again, and obviously he never caused any other problems where he went, otherwise he probably would be arrested. Unless he found his way out of it again like he did with the Burke. All all the mischief that Burke and Hare caused and all the murders that they caused actually led to the Anatomy Act of 1832. So the Anatomy Act of 1832 allowed bodies to be donated for medical use. That was really, at that time, game-changing since, as I mentioned, there was just such a shortage of corpses for medical students to be using. This also allowed for the dissection of bodies that were from workhouses. They are allowed to dissect bodies from workhouses if they haven't been claimed for 48 hours. Sad thing about that is workhouses, they were for poor people, they were for people that couldn't afford homes, housing. It also was for people that had mental problems or disabilities, and even like orphans, homeless children, all of that. In its own way, it's pretty sick and twisted that they either allowed bodies to be donated, or if you passed away in a workhouse, your body could be donated then. Burke and Hare are known as the most famous grave robbers, but they actually never robbed a grave. They never dug anyone out of the ground. Another kind of super creepy, interesting thing about this story is in 1836, two boys in a park where everything was going on, they found these dolls. They found 17 dolls, each in their own mini coffin. It's still not known today who made the dolls, why the dolls are there. There's a lot of speculation that the dolls were made by either Burke or Hare, and each one represented a victim. Today, there is 8 of the 17 dolls left, and you can actually go see them in the National Museum of Scotland. Thanks for watching my video on Burke and Hare and a little background and history on them. They're probably my favorite creepy, spooky story. I think it's totally wild. I loved learning about them when I first read about them. I hope that you guys liked learning about them as much as I did. If you enjoyed my video on Burke and Hare, be sure to subscribe and give a thumbs up button, because I definitely will be making more Sunday spooky story videos. I have lots of different topics that I want to keep covering for a bunch of different things, whether it be aliens, hauntings, folklore, more murderers, or just legends. Thanks for watching the video. Let me know what you thought about it, if you know this story or not, if there's any other information that you know on them. Also would love to know if there's any specific stories or people that you want to see covered here. Okay, thanks for watching, guys. I had a lot of fun making this video and getting to talk about Burke and Hare.